Annapolis, Maryland. May 1945. The warehouse lights hummed like tired bees as Dr. Robert Goddard stood before the captured German V-2, a silver spear laid on trestles under Navy custody. He barely moved. Throat cancer had ground his voice down to a rough whisper, and yet his fingertips spoke for him, skimming the cold aluminum skin as if reading a confession in Braille. For 2 decades, he had been the odd prophet in America's scientific wilderness, piecing liquid-fueled rockets together on thin grants and stubborn belief, while the government looked past him to nearer wars and safer bets. Now surrounded by Army ordnance officers and Navy engineers, he faced a machine that did not just answer his questions, it outran them. To the officers, the V-2 was a weapon. To Goddard, it was an ecosystem. The Germans had not merely assembled a missile. They had built an industrial revolution around rocketry. He could sense it in the flawless seams, the confident weight of each component, the way even the fasteners seemed to declare purpose. America had been asleep at the launch pad, and this warehouse, bracketed by clipboards, uniforms, and the smell of oil, had become a wake-up room. He circled the 46-foot body, counting problems solved that he had battled alone under New Mexico skies: liquid oxygen and alcohol, turbine-driven feed systems, gyroscopic stability, thrust vectoring. For years, he begged for resources to scale ideas beyond prototypes. Here was scale incarnate. The uncomfortable truth pressed in from the dim rafters: the Germans had not just leapt ahead in capability. They had invented solutions to problems most American teams had not yet named, built with tolerances American factories rarely attempted, and refined processes that implied a laboratory nation instead of a lone laboratory. While America had Robert Goddard, Germany had Piedmont thousands of scientists, state money without apology, and a 7-year head start that would reverberate through the next decade. What Goddard could not see from this single vantage point was the width of the chasm. Beyond these walls, somewhere between collapsing fronts and hurried surrender, the first hints had already surfaced: a network of underground production lines, crates of technical drawings, precision parts stacked like coin in the dark. The revelation would travel by train and by rumor, by classified cable and whispered assessment. And it would land here in rooms like this where men with rulers and wrenches tried to measure shock. He paused at the tail, eyes settling on the graphite control vanes set to bite the exhaust, then on the seams that betrayed the presence of a cooling labyrinth in the chamber walls. His own notebooks flickered through his mind, pages smudged by desert wind. He was right about the physics. He had always been right about the physics. But physics does not pour metal or forge turbine blades or train crews to repeat excellence 600 times a month. An officer asked a polite question about thrust. Goddard's whisper caught. 60,000 pounds. The figures would later say an engine 60 times stronger than his biggest success, built not once, but by the 100. It was a lesson wrapped in aluminum. Genius can light the path, but only institutions can pave it. Outside, gulls argued over the Severn River, and the afternoon shifted toward amber. Inside, under warehouse light, a frail man and a captured rocket held the future between them. The first step to catching up is admitting you are behind. In May 1945, in Annapolis, America finally looked the truth in the eye. April 11, 1945, in the Harz Mountains, the war sounded different boots on wet stone, voices clipped to whispers, the echo of industry buried inside a mountain. Soldiers of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division stepped through a blast door and into the middlework tunnels near Nordhausen, expecting another munitions warren. What opened before them felt endless. Galleries carved like arteries, electric lights strung along concrete ribs, and stretching away in serial precision, assembly lines of rockets in every stage of becoming. Noses swaddled in canvas, fins nested on pallets, wiring looms draped like vines. Everything smelled of cutting oil and panic. The first shock was scale. The second was inventory. Wooden crates labeled with meticulous German handwriting. Piles of injector plates. Turbo pump housings wrapped in paper against dust. Rooms smothered with technical documents, blueprints, test logs, tolerance charts stacked shoulder high and tied off with twine. Here was a factory that did not merely make a weapon. It manufactured a process. Each V-2, the soldiers would learn, demanded roughly 50,000 parts, and somehow this underground city had orchestrated it all to a drumbeat of 600 missiles per month. For a regime on the verge of collapse, it did not look like collapse at all. Then came the third shock, the one that burned after the lights were switched off. Emaciated prisoners emerged from side chambers, striped uniforms hanging from bones, eyes rimmed in a gray that spoke of nights without end. Middle Badora had supplied the labor-enslaved men and women who bolted turbines and soldered harnesses until they fell, then were replaced. The rockets that would arch over London were born in a place where more people died making them than the missiles would kill. The future, it turned out, had a tomb beneath it. Major James Hamill of Army Ordnance moved through the tunnels with a notebook and a quickening pulse. He counted final assembly bays. He traced cables to control panels. He ran a hand over the smooth curvature of an oxygen tank and did the math in the margins. He understood, with the cold clarity of an engineer, that this was not simply a trove. It was leverage on tomorrow. In weeks, the front lines would harden into occupation zones. The Soviets were coming, and by agreement their line would slice this mountain into their custody. If the Americans did not move now, every drawing, every part, every partially completed rocket would cross an invisible border into Stalin's new arsenal. The cable to Washington was urgent and unadorned. Within hours, Colonel Holger Toftoy, Ordnance's bulldog of procurement, received his orders: get the rockets, get the documents, get them out before the Soviets arrive. Trucks began to growl. Forklifts spun in tight circles. GIs formed human chains to pass crates hand to hand, paper to paper, knowledge to knowledge. On makeshift clipboards, officers converted a labyrinth into a loading plan. Railway cars clanked into position and filled first by the dozen, then by the 100. In the end, 341 cars would rumble toward Antwerp, groaning under V-2 components enough to assemble roughly 100 missiles, plus tons of technical archives. It was logistics as strategy, a race couched as a timetable, and every hour stolen from the calendar felt like an hour stolen from a rival superpower. Liberty ships would take the baton at the docks, decks stacked with a future captured in steel and ink, bound for a desert in New Mexico where men with slide rules would try to read what a mountain had been forced to write. In the HARS that day, the Americans learned a grim equation. Industrial genius plus moral ruin could still yield a technological lead. The question no one could yet answer was how to keep the first and bury the second. They called it Special Mission V-2, but it felt less like a mission than a heist against the calendar. In the weeks after Nordhausen, the mountain disgorged its secrets onto rail spurs at a breakneck rhythm. Crates banged shut, stencils hissed. Manifests grew long and impatient. The plan was brutally simple: empty the tunnels, outrun the map. By the time the last whistles blew, 341 railway cars groaned under the weight of disassembled futures. Turbo pumps in straw, injector heads in wax paper, guidance racks bolted into frames so they would not bruise. Coil after coil of wiring went aboard like ropes salvaged from a sinking ship. Technical documents, tons of them, were stacked tight, their twine handles biting the palms of soldiers who understood, even if dimly, that paper could be more explosive than powder. The trains rattled toward Antwerp, cutting a clattering path through a continent still coughing smoke. At the port, Liberty ships waited like open mouths, their cranes ticking and squealing as they lifted Germany's midnight industry into American daylight. Somewhere between hatches and holds, a new reality settled in. This was not a trophy haul, but a syllabus. The cargo manifests might as well have read curriculum in applied rocketry. What the ships carried across the Atlantic was not just hardware. It was the order of operations for winning the future. By late May, the first consignments reached the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico's Tularosa Basin. where missile-range winds combed the desert flat and the sky looked big enough to forgive ambition. Warehouses filled fast. Engineers set up tree-off tables, wooden horses topped with brown paper, where each crate became a question, and each question a rabbit hole. They took to the work like archivists at a crime scene. Labels were translated, part numbers reconciled to drawings, drawings reconciled to assemblies, and assemblies propped open to reveal intentions. With each lid pried up, the technological gap widened until it felt like a canyon. They started with the broad strokes, because that is how you steady the hand. The V-2 Aggregate 4, the Germans called it, stood 46 feet tall and weighed nearly 28,000 pounds at launch. It could hurl a 1-ton warhead roughly 200 miles with what the era dared call reasonable accuracy. Impressive on paper, but the paper was just the overture. The real music began inside. When the team unbolted the engine section, a collective breath went shallow. At the base sat a combustion chamber that promised 60,000 pounds of thrust, its double-walled jacket an elegant sermon in heat management. Alcohol fuel snaked through that outer skin first, stealing heat from the metal while preheating itself for combustion, a regenerative loop that turned survival into efficiency. Here was a solution to a problem American rocketeers mostly framed as prayer: how to keep a chamber from tearing itself apart at 5,100 degrees Fahrenheit. The desert light shifted. Magnifying lenses hovered over weld beads with the intimacy of confession. Weight and balance ledgers grew thick. Someone rolled a nickel across a machined face just to watch it glide without a hitch. Another pried up a cover plate and found tolerances so tight they seemed to whisper back that guesswork was not welcome here. Sketches of plumbing sprawled across butcher paper like subway maps, each valve a decision, each bend a bet against catastrophe. What unnerved the veterans most was the confidence of it all. The way design, production, and field servicing had clearly been taught to speak the same language. In the evenings, the wind picked up and drove grit against the hangar doors. Inside, calipers clicked and pencils scraped. Now and then an engineer would stop, eyes resting on a graphite vane or a gyroscope housing, and the room would feel very quiet. The learning curve stretched ahead like a launch trajectory, steep, unforgiving, and pointed beyond the atmosphere. They saved the heart for last, as if delaying the moment might soften the blow. When the engine bay finally lay bare on trestles at White Sands, the room cinched tight with silence. Here was the V-2's hot soul, a bell-shaped combustion chamber crouched above a forest of valves and pipes, its double-walled skin promising to drink its own heat to stay alive. Alcohol would course first through that outer jacket, strip the fire from the metal, preheat itself in the bargain, and then dive into a furnace where temperatures climbed toward 5,100 degrees Fahrenheit. Regenerative cooling, yes, the concept existed in American notebooks, but this was regenerative cooling executed with a machinist's arrogance, every seam a dare to entropy. Numbers, at last, gave the awe somewhere to sit. 60,000 pounds of thrust at full roar, an engine 60 times more powerful than Goddard's best 985-pound effort, and not a museum piece, but a product, a thing made in batches and stamped with serial pride. The chamber's throat, where materials went to melt, showed careful contouring and a finish like burnished stone. Welds curved with the calm of a steady hand and an institutional memory. Even the mounting lugs carried a quiet overbuild, as if the rocket's bones had been taught to distrust optimism. But the true spell lived in the turbopump, the nervous system's metronome. American engineers ringed it the way sailors gather at a new star. A steam-driven turbine, compact and coiled with intent, spun at roughly 4,000 revolutions per minute to drive paired centrifugal pumps that forced propellants into the chamber at about 125 liters per second. The turbine itself delivered something like 600 horsepower while bathing one side of its anatomy in steam heat and the other in liquid oxygen cold, at minus 297 degrees. Materials had to be bilingual, one moment enduring heat that would seize a lesser alloy, the next resisting a cryogenic bite that made steel brittle as chalk. The blades told the rest of the story. Nickel-chromium alloys carefully forged, wore a satin that spoke of furnace discipline and confident metallurgy. The pump housings felt like sculpture from a culture that worshipped tolerances. Seals sat so true that the thought of oxygen leakage at speed a white, vicious ghost seemed almost impolite. Every rotating mass had been balanced to a moral standard. One nick, one speck of imbalance, and the machine would unspool itself in a heartbeat. It did not. Not often, anyway. The Germans had learned their lesson in thousands of test runs, each failure feeding the craft until failure turned rare. The Americans kept circling with notebooks half full and pride half swallowed. At Caltech, Theodore von Karman had warned, the gap was not months, it was year 7, by his sober estimate, and this hardware made the warning feel conservative. Lieutenant Commander Robert Truax, after tracing the steam lines and peering into the pump inlet, drafted an assessment with the weight of a verdict. This was not simply a head start, it was a missing staircase. To duplicate the pump alone would mean inventing alloys, casting techniques, inspection methods, confidence. Even with money unchecked and materials somehow conjured from a post-war world still short of everything, a single working American prototype might take 18 months. And that was the optimistic line. Someone flicked a fingernail against a housing and listened to the note. It sang clear, unfrayed. In that tone was the shape of the problem. America had ideas, but Germany had institutions tuned to turn ideas into parts that fit, spin, and live at the edge of physics. Before you can close a gap like that, you have to admit you are hearing it. If propulsion was the heart, guidance was the whispering brain, the place where the rocket learned to know itself in flight. The Americans lifted a gray, compact box from the V-2's midsection and set it down as gently as if it could bruise. This was the analog computer the Germans called the Mistgerät, a bundle of resolute arithmetic and whirring conviction. Wires braided into looms fed it, and from it ran the nerves that would move control surfaces against the rushing air and the roaring flame. They started with the gyros, because motion without reference is just a fall. 2 free gyroscopes, one commanding pitch, the other sharing duty between yaw and roll, spun with a stubborn insistence on straightness. Their gimbals pivoted with velvet reluctance, and when an engineer nudged one with a fingertip, the instrument answered not with drama, but with authority. Precision lived here in brass and bearing, the engineering equivalent of a metronome that refuses to lie. Nearby, the pendulous integrating gyroscopic accelerometer, an ungainly phrase for a devastatingly elegant idea, did something more than measure force. It took acceleration, integrated it over time, and gave velocity back as a signal. When the rocket's speed reached the program's number, the computer cut the engine, not by guess, but by calculus in motion. Signals ran outward to 8 hands on the world, for aerodynamic rudders hinged on the tail fins, and 4 graphite veins thrust into the exhaust like oars into a molten river. Those veins worked in the first frantic seconds, when airspeed was low and the plume's vector mattered most, biting into gas hotter than furnaces dared, holding their shape because graphite, if you treat it right, will stare back at 5,000 degrees and not blink. Later, as the rocket gathered air and attitude, the tail rudders took the lead, trading furnace work for airflow with a competence earned in wind tunnels and field trials. Dr. Charles Stark Draper came to White Sands, a man who knew gyros like a violinist knows strings, and even he paused. He would spend years teaching aircraft and submarines to sense their own errors. Here, the Germans had solved integration in hardware and made closed-loop control feel inevitable. Fly by wire, not by name, perhaps, but in essence and deployed on a battlefield before most Americans thought such architecture practical. Quality bled into every corner. The wiring harnesses, 8 miles of them, were lashed and routed with a sailor's discipline, labeled for men who would fault find in mud and fear. The electrical system carried 24 volts, not the 12 of American habit, and redundancy was woven through like a superstition that had proved itself true. Power came from a generator on the main turbopump and a separate auxiliary turbine. If one coughed, the other could still keep valves obedient, gyro spinning. relays chattering in code. Boxes opened to reveal circuit breakers in profusion, a refusal to let a single short cascade into catastrophe. Tolerances hid in places no casual eye would look, the centering on a Euro rotor, the preload of a bearing, the minute clearance where a vane's shaft entered hot metal and yet must not seize. In the notes of the American evaluators ran a theme too plain to ignore. This was not a clever prototype. It was a system trained for war. The Germans had built their guidance to survive vibration, shock, weather, men, and the cruel arithmetic of chance. Watching the needles settle and the rotors hum, the Americans learned a harsh corollary to genius. Reliability is not an insight, it is an attitude, hammered into every part until the whole can be trusted at speed. The cargo had crossed an ocean. The knowledge would have to cross a far more treacherous sea. In September 1945, under a policy that wore the bland name Operation Paperclip like a mask, 127 German rocketeers stepped onto American soil under military custody. They came with notebooks in their heads and shadows at their heels. Wernher von Braun and his colleagues had engineered Hitler's vengeance weapons. Some wore SS ranks in photographs the censors could not erase. The same middlework tunnels that taught the world how to mass-produce a future had devoured the enslaved people who built it. Every briefing at Fort Bliss had a ghost in the room. Yet the calculus of a new era clicked on with the indifference of a metronome. The Soviets were moving to crating up Peenemann's remains, recruiting their share of the German talent, planting a parallel seed east of the Elbe. The Cold War did not wait for scruples to reach consensus. America's wager, stark and unlovely, was that knowledge gained under a black flag could be bent to a different purpose in daylight. White sands became the proving ground for this uneasy inheritance. The desert wore a hard, clean horizon, the kind of line that tempts men to aim for it. Crates were unpacked with the same reverence and suspicion one reserves for a captured animal. German technicians, now specialists, penned notes in accented English. American engineers built scaffolds of procedure around instincts honed on different battlefields. Together they tried to reassemble not only machines, but continuity, the invisible thread of practice that lives in a shop's habits and a team's muscle memory. On March 15, 1946, the first static test firing took its breath and then roared. Sound tumbled across the gypsum and came back as thunder. Oil drums skittered. Men flinched and then grinned, their cheeks smeared with the same mixture of pride and grit that attends any engine's first hot truth. A month later, April 16th at 2:47 in the afternoon, they lit a full stack. The V-2 shouldered the sky and stumbled. A fin separated. Guidance hiccuped into chaos. The rocket clawed to 3.4 miles and then returned to the desert with all the grace of a falling anvil. The crater's edge filled with silence. Colonel Harold R. Turner spoke what everyone felt. Hardware in hand and experts on contract did not equal the missing years of practice. Germany had launched thousands of times across test stands and war zones. America was counting from zero. Failure, however, is a good teacher if you pay attention as well as parts. Over the next few years, they launched 67 captured V-2s, some lifting clean, some corkscrewing into embarrassment, many doing both in the same afternoon. Roughly two-thirds succeeded by the Army's tally, a rate no one would accept in combat, but everyone accepted in school. With each flight, data spilled in like rain. Pressures, temperatures, skin loads, vibration spectra, the sly ways that high-altitude aerodynamics bend intuition until it snaps. And then, a small miracle of perspective. On October 24, 1946, a V-2 carried a 35mm camera in its nose and rose to about 65 miles. It came back with grainy frames that turned a desert warehouse into a chapel. There was earth clouds like torn gauze, curvature confessing itself to geometry, the black above not night, but space. A weapon had blinked and seen home from the edge of a way. In the photo lab, men hooped and then went quiet, as if laughter had knocked on a door they had not known was there. Terror's ladder, it seemed, could also be a rung toward wonder. By 1948, the lesson of the warehouse had hardened into a plan. The Army chose Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, as the place where captured knowledge would turn into native craft. The move looked administrative on paper. In reality, it was a transplant. Wernher von Braun's team escorted it first, then embraced cautiously left West Texas for a patchwork of cotton fields and machine shops that would become an American Piedmont without the darkness in its foundations. Around them, the United States began building the one thing Germany had possessed all along, an ecosystem. Suppliers learned to live by tolerances they once called impractical. Universities tuned their curricula to a new vocabulary of cryogenics, guidance, and structures. Test ranges and telemetry chains stretched like nerves across the desert. Money steady, not spectacular, arrived often enough to plan around. The first native heir to the V-2 was named Redstone, a disciplined descendant rather than a copy. It kept the V-2's essential grammar liquid oxygen and alcohol, turbopump feed, gyros and thrust vectoring, but rewrote the syntax for American industry and doctrine. Welding procedures became reproducible rather than mystical. Guidance grew surer with each flight, inches traded for insight. The launch crews gained something Goddard had seldom enjoyed: repetition. In rocketry, repetition is the mother of confidence. From Redstone, a family tree thickened. Jupiter, Thor, and Atlas stepped from drafting rooms into sunlight, each a fresh argument that America's scattered strengths: Caltech's mathematics, MIT's instruments, Douglas and Convair structures, North American's engines. The Army's scheduling and stubbornness could be taught to sing in harmony. The weapons these missiles promised were blunt truths of the age, but the machinery they demanded was a rehearsal for something less martial and more audacious. Then the sky itself called the roll. On October 4, 1957, Sputnik crossed over with a beeping that sounded like a metronome inside the American skull. The nation that had arrived late to the warehouse found itself late to orbit. Pride flushed. Budgets followed. But panic is a poor engineer, and what answered Sputnik was not frenzy, but a practicum. On January 31, 1958, Explorer 1 rode a Juno IA Jupiter C derivative of Redstone into the cold clarity above the atmosphere. The payload was small, but the meaning was large. America could put instruments where curiosity required them. In the data came surprise. James Van Allen's team saw radiation belts cinching Earth like invisible armor. Terror's technology, again, was repurposed as a ladder to knowledge. Huntsville, meanwhile, matured into NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, and the conversation turned from how high to how far. The Saturn family began as sketches on paper that already smelled faintly of the sea of tranquility. At the heart of its largest member, the Saturn V, sat 5 F1 engines whose scale strained metaphor. Each produced roughly 1.5 million pounds of thrust, 25 V-2's foot worth in a single bell, and together they wove 7.5 million pounds of push into a column, of fire that daylight could barely contain. Yet the DNA was straight from the desert crates, regenerative cooling as covenant, turbo pumps as heartbeat, gimbaled engines as muscles, guidance that no longer merely corrected but commanded. Somewhere in those years, the comparison shifted from Goddard versus Germany to Goddard and Germany versus what comes next. The solitary genius had been right about the physics. The wartime machine had been right about the scale. What America finally learned was to braid insight to institution until neither was lonely. Workshops that once doubted thousandths of an inch began to swear by them. Young engineers grew old on launch pads, their signatures repeating on drawings until habit became culture. The gap closed not with a single triumph, but with 1,000 kept promises to process. By the time the countdowns turned lunar, the warehouse shame had been reworked into a national muscle memory. Legacies are rarely tidy, and the V-2s may be the messiest of all. It was terror in a streamlined casing, a weapon that spent lives twice, first in the tunnels that birthed it, then in the cities it struck. Yet for American engineers, unpacking those crates in 1945, it also became a teacher, the kind that makes you blush before it lets you learn. In the years that followed, the nation rewrote its own script. The United States that once left Robert Goddard to work in wind-blown isolation began, at last, to fund the long road between a good idea and a launch-ready system. Laboratories multiplied. Curricula changed. Factories heard a stricter timekeeper and found they could march to it. Goddard himself did not live to see the full confession or the full correction, but the country etched his name in institutional stone. In May 1959, when NASA dedicated the Goddard Space Flight Center, Administrator T. Keith Glennon delivered a truth that held both pride and penance. Goddard dreamed of rockets to the moon and built machines that clawed to 9,000 feet. The Germans, working in their own lineage, not simply on stolen insights, had already crossed the low border of space. What mattered now, Glennon implied, was the lesson that genius needs scaffolding, vision needs budgets, and national leadership in technology is not a weather event, it is a climate you choose to maintain. 3 conclusions hardened out of the heat. First, missiles and spaceflight were not curiosities, but the geometry of modern power. Whoever could throw mass across oceans or into orbit would write the margins of the age. Second, leadership could be lost by neglect and recaptured only by grinding investment, not by speeches or slogans. Third, in a Cold War that widened every year, the high ground, orbital paths, and ballistic arcs was strategy itself. You did not need clairvoyance to see this. You only needed to stand in an Annapolis warehouse beside a man with a ruined voice and a captured rocket and admit, we are behind. If the beginning was humiliation, the middle became muscle memory, and the end, at least for that first chapter, was a July morning in 1969. Cape Canaveral simmered. A countdown folded into a country's breath. The Saturn V rose, a cathedral of thrust built from equations Goddard loved and production disciplines America had learned the hard way. Wernher von Braun watched the column of fire lift Apollo 11 toward the Sea of Tranquility and said what the journey had proven. The physics were clear decades earlier. What changed was commitment. In that line sat the answer to the warehouse question. Nothing mystical separates failure from triumph in engineering, only appetite, honesty, and time spent well. The warehouse in Annapolis is gone now, its lights long cooled, its rafters reclaimed by ordinary air. But the revelation that flickered there did not vanish. It traveled into budgets and bylaws, into the quiet tyranny of checklists, into the way a young engineer learns to distrust easy numbers and love the discipline that makes hard ones behave. The V-2, born of a ruinous purpose, turned out to be a mirror and a syllabus. America stared into it, saw the cost of improvising a future on the cheap, and then paid forward. In the end, the verdict is paradox with a pulse. The V-2 was Germany's vengeance, and America's wake-up call. A machine that showed what a nation can do when it decides that tomorrow deserves factories as much as dreams. The gap closed because the country stopped pretending there was not one. From that admission flowed the investments, the institutions, and the patience that, in scarcely 24 years, carried footsteps to lunar dust. The lesson persists. Those who fail to fund the future will be measured by those who do.